At Thanksgiving party, my grandma yelled at me. Why is an elderly couple living in the $1 million vacation home I bought for you? I froze and said, what are you talking about? I'm homeless right now. At that moment, my sister turned pale. Then the lawyer arrived. I want to back up before I get to the part where my grandmother stood up mid-dinner and changed everything, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what my family had already trained me to accept as normal. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I was 26, working a marketing job that paid enough to survive and not much else, and renting a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner that smelled permanently like steam and starch. I liked it there. It was mine, in the way that renting can feel like yours when you've never owned anything and don't expect to for a long time. In February, my landlord sold the building to a developer. Everyone in the 4 units got the same letter. 60 days to vacate, a check for 1 month's rent as compensation, and a phone number for a relocation service that never once answered when I called it. 60 days sounds like a lot until you're the one living inside them. I spent the first 2 weeks assuming it would work itself out, the way you assume things will work out when you've never had a real crisis before and don't know yet what one costs. Then I spent the next 4 weeks actually looking, and found out what a one-bedroom in my city cost in a year, when apparently everyone else had the same idea I did. I called my parents first, not because I expected them to solve it, but because that's what you do. You tell your parents when something is going wrong. You assume that's still the shape your relationship has even after you've grown up and moved out and mostly stopped needing them for anything. My mother's response was, well, you should have been saving more aggressively. This is exactly why I always told you to build an emergency fund, which was true, and also not an answer to the actual problem, which was that I had 11 days left on my lease and nowhere confirmed to go. My father didn't say much of anything. He asked how the apartment search was going, the way you'd ask a coworker about a project that wasn't really your concern, and then he changed the subject to something about his golf league. Neither of them offered their house. I want to be precise about that because it matters later. They have a 4-bedroom house with 2 of those bedrooms sitting empty since I moved out at 22. Nobody offered. I didn't ask directly because some small stubborn part of me kept waiting for them to offer first, the way you'd hope a parent would offer without needing to be asked. And when that didn't happen, I couldn't bring myself to ask out loud and confirm that it wasn't coming. My sister was different, and the pattern matters. Her name is Ashley. She's 2 years older than me, married to a guy named Kevin, whose family has money in a way that our family has never had money. The kind of money where nobody in his family has ever had to think about 60-day notices or relocation services that don't pick up the phone. Ashley married into that world 4 years ago, and it changed the texture of how she talked about things. Vacations became getting away. Restaurants became places where you didn't look at the prices first. She started saying things like, we're between properties right now, about houses that weren't actually properties. They were just houses, but the vocabulary had shifted along with everything else. When I called Ashley about the eviction, she was sympathetic in the specific way people are sympathetic when they have no intention of actually helping. Lots of, oh my god, that's so stressful. Lots of, let me know if you need anything, delivered in a tone that made clear the anything had an invisible asterisk on it, some fine print excluding every concrete thing I might actually need. I asked if I could stay with her and Kevin for a week or 2 while I sorted things out. Just a placeholder, I said, just until I find something. She said it wasn't a great time. Kevin's parents were in and out a lot right now, she said. Their schedule was unpredictable. The guest room wasn't really available the way I might be picturing it. She said maybe try mom and dad's. They had the space. I want you to sit with that phrase for a minute. Kevin's parents were in and out a lot right now. Their schedule was unpredictable. I heard that sentence in April and had no reason to think about it again until Thanksgiving, when it would suddenly mean something completely different than what I'd assumed at the time. I didn't try mom and dad's because I'd already gotten close enough to that conversation to know how it would go. Instead, I called my friend Bria, who I'd known since college and who had a pull-out couch and a spare closet, and more importantly, didn't have any invisible asterisks in her offer. Obviously, she said when I asked if I could stay for a couple weeks while I found a place. Obviously, come now, don't even wait until the lease is up. A couple weeks turned into a month turned into 3. My apartment search kept dying at the finish line. Approved for a place, then the landlord went with someone with a higher income. Approved for a second place, then it fell through when the building failed an inspection. By the time summer ended, I had stopped telling people I was in between apartments and started just saying I didn't have one, because the polite version of the sentence had stopped feeling honest. I told my parents this was still going on, more than once. I told Ashley too, in a group text that had gone mostly quiet since April, except for occasional restaurant recommendations and photos of things Kevin's family was doing. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Nobody offered the guest room, the spare bedroom, the couch, anything. I stopped bringing it up around July, not because it had resolved, but because bringing it up and getting silence back had started to feel worse than just not saying anything. Here is the detail that I didn't understand the significance of until much later. My grandmother had been overseas for almost 4 years by that point. She'd moved to Portugal after my grandfather died, chasing some combination of grief and a fresh start and a much lower cost of living, and she called occasionally, but the time difference made real conversations rare. She sent checks sometimes, birthday and Christmas, modest ones, the kind of gift that says I'm thinking of you rather than I'm trying to solve your financial life. I did not know, because nobody had ever told me, that 3 years earlier, right around the time I graduated and started my first real job, right around the time everyone in my family started talking to me like I was finally a fully formed adult who didn't need help with anything, my grandmother had wired the down payment on a lakeside vacation property in my name as a gift for my future, the kind of gift grandparents parents give when they've done well for themselves and want the next generation to start ahead instead of starting from zero the way she had. I did not know this because I had never been shown a deed, never signed a closing document, never once been told a house existed with my name on it. I found out about all of it on the same night I found out an elderly couple I'd never met was currently living inside it. Thanksgiving fell in the last week of November that year, and my grandmother had flown back for it, her first Thanksgiving in the country in 4 years. A surprise she'd apparently planned as exactly that, a surprise. Nobody had told her about my apartment situation because I hadn't told her, because our calls were occasional and mostly consisted of her updates about Portugal and my updates about work. Nothing that ever drilled down into, by the way, I've been on a friend's couch since March. What none of us knew, sitting down at that table, was that she had already stopped by a property before coming to dinner. A lakeside house, my house, though I didn't know it yet. And she had already spoken to the people living inside it, already heard them describe themselves as her granddaughter's in-laws, already done the math in her head about what that meant, and arrived at an answer that made her furious before she'd even taken her coat off. That's the part I want you to hold on to going into what happened at that table. She wasn't confused. She wasn't jet-lagged and misremembering. She had already seen the house with her own eyes, already met the couple living in it, and she sat down to dinner already knowing something was deeply wrong. She was just waiting to see who would tell her the truth and who would lie to her face. Dinner started normally, or as normally as it ever did in my family, which is to say everyone performed a version of closeness that didn't actually require anyone to ask real questions. My mother had made the turkey the same way she'd made it every year, dry in the breast and overcooked at the edges, and everyone complimented it the same way they did every year because the compliment was the tradition, not the accuracy of it. My grandmother arrived 20 minutes into the meal, still in her travel coat, having come straight from the airport without stopping to change. That should have told everyone something was off. She was famously particular about arriving properly dressed for family occasions, had been her whole life, and showing up in a wrinkled coat with her suitcase still in the car was completely unlike her. Nobody registered it as a warning sign. Everyone was too busy being delighted she was there at all, standing up for hugs, exclaiming about how long it had been, pulling out a chair for her at the head of the table like nothing was wrong. I hugged her too. I remember she held on to me a beat longer than the hug required, and I remember thinking at the time that it was just emotion, 4 years of distance collapsing into one hug. I understand now that she was already looking at me while she held on, already searching my face for something, already trying to figure out if I looked like someone who'd been living in a house she'd bought me or someone who hadn't. She sat. She let my mother fill her plate. She made small talk about the flight, about Portugal, about how strange it felt to be back in a house that hadn't changed at all while everything else apparently had. I remember thinking that last comment was just a general observation about time passing. It wasn't. She was already circling the actual subject, testing the water before she waded all the way in. About 15 minutes into her being there, she set down her fork with a precision that felt deliberate, the kind of small gesture that changes the temperature of a room before anyone said a word. "Mandy," she said, "that's not my real name either, but it's close enough for this story. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me." I said, of course, thinking she was about to ask something ordinary. "How's work? Are you seeing anyone?" The standard grandmother inventory. "Why is there an elderly couple living in the lakeside house I bought you 3 years ago?" I want to describe the silence that followed as accurately as I can, because it wasn't a normal silence. It was the specific silence of a room full of people who all suddenly understood something at slightly different speeds. My father's fork stopping halfway to his mouth, my mother's face doing something complicated and fast before settling into stillness, my sister Ashley going very, very still in the way you go still when you're hoping stillness might make you invisible. I was the only one who didn't understand yet, and so I was the only one who could actually respond. "What are you talking about?" I said. "I don't own a house. I'm homeless right now, Grandma. I've been sleeping on my friend's couch since March." I watched something shift in my grandmother's face when I said that. Not confusion. She'd clearly already known the broad shape of what was happening. She'd seen the house herself before dinner, but something more like confirmation landing. The last piece of a picture she'd already mostly assembled clicking into place with a violence that showed in her jaw. "Homeless," she repeated very quietly. "Since March." "Since February, technically," I said, because apparently my brain decided this was the moment for precision. "My lease ended and I couldn't find anywhere that worked out. I've been at my friend Priya's." My grandmother turned her head slowly and looked at my sister. Ashley had not said a single word since my grandmother sat down. She was looking at her wine glass with the specific intensity of someone doing everything possible to avoid making eye contact with anyone else at the table, turning the stem slightly between two fingers like the motion itself might buy her time. "Ashley," my grandmother said, "look at me." Ashley looked up. Her face had gone pale in a way I'd never actually seen on her before. Not embarrassed pale, something closer to caught pale, the specific color of someone watching a structure they'd built start to visibly buckle. "I don't know what you mean," Ashley said, which was such an obviously insufficient answer that even my father winced slightly beside her. "I mean," my grandmother said, and her voice had dropped into a register I associate with the handful of times in my life I've seen her genuinely angry, quiet instead of loud, which is somehow always worse. "That 3 years ago I wired $400,000 as a down payment on a property at Cedar Lake. I put it in trust for Mandy. I have the wire confirmation, I have the closing paperwork, I have every email from the title company. That house exists. It has a deed. And this afternoon before I came here, I drove past it because I wanted to see it before dinner, because I've been picturing that house for 3 years from a different continent, and I wanted to see it in person." She paused. Nobody filled the silence, because nobody at that table besides me had any idea what was coming, and even I could feel the shape of something enormous approaching without yet knowing its dimensions. There was a couple living there, my grandmother continued. In their 70s, I'd guess. Very polite. They came to the door when I knocked because I still had a key, and I let myself onto the porch, and they came out looking confused about who I was. So I asked them who they were, and they told me they were Ashley's in-laws, Kevin's parents. They said Ashley had told them they could stay there as long as they needed. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the specific tick of the old clock in the hallway, the one nobody had adjusted for daylight savings in years, and so was permanently 40 minutes wrong, ticking through a silence that felt like it belonged to a much bigger room than my parents' dining room actually was. My mother was the one who broke the silence, which didn't surprise me, because my mother has spent my entire life being the one who steps in front of an uncomfortable moment and tries to smother it before it can finish happening. Mom, your flight was so long, she said, reaching over to touch my grandmother's arm. You must be exhausted, and jet lag can really do strange things to how you remember details. Maybe we should just eat and talk about this tomorrow when you've rested. My memory, my grandmother said, not raising her voice, which somehow made it land harder than if she had, is completely intact, Sandra. I am not confused about a wire transfer of $400,000. I am not confused about a house with my granddaughter's name on the deed. I watched two strangers walk out onto that porch 2 hours ago. Do not tell me this is jet lag. My mother's hand withdrew from my grandmother's arm like she'd touched something hot. She didn't try the jet lag angle again. There's probably an explanation, my father said, which is the kind of sentence that sounds reasonable until you notice it doesn't actually propose an explanation. Just gestures vaguely toward the possibility that one exists somewhere, held by someone else. Certainly not something he needed to produce himself. Then someone should produce it, my grandmother said, because right now the only person at this table who seems to know anything is the one who won't speak. Everyone looked at Ashley again. She'd picked her wine glass back up and was holding it without drinking from it, a prop for her hands more than an actual drink. Kevin's parents needed somewhere to stay, she said finally, choosing her words with the visible care of someone building a sentence out of the least incriminating pieces available. They're between houses. It's a big property. It wasn't like it was being used for anything. It seemed like it made sense. Between houses, my grandmother repeated. For how long? Ashley hesitated. A while. Ashley, my grandmother's voice sharpened. How long? Almost a year, Ashley said very quietly, and I watched my mother's eyes close briefly. The specific closed eyes of someone realizing a lie they'd been protecting was about to be much bigger than they'd hoped. I want to pause here and note something, because it's the moment I started doing math I hadn't let myself do before. Almost a year. That timeline sat uncomfortably close to my own timeline. The eviction in February, the couch surfing that started in March and never stopped. I hadn't put those dates side by side yet. I was about to. An elderly couple has been living in a house that belongs to my granddaughter, my grandmother said, for almost a year, during which time my granddaughter has been sleeping on a friend's couch because she had nowhere else to go. Is that an accurate summary of what's happened here? Nobody answered that directly, which was itself an answer. I asked you, I said to Ashley, and I could hear my own voice shaking slightly. Not with sadness exactly, more like the specific tremor that comes right before real anger arrives. In April, I asked if I could stay with you for a couple of weeks. You told me it wasn't a good time. You said Kevin's parents were in and out a lot, that their schedule was unpredictable. Ashley didn't say anything. Their schedule wasn't unpredictable, I said, and I heard my own voice get louder without deciding to let it. They were living there, permanently, in a house that was apparently mine, and you told me to try mom and dad's instead, like you were doing me a favor by redirecting me somewhere else when the actual answer was that you didn't want me anywhere near a house you already knew wasn't yours. It's not that simple, Ashley started. Explain how it's not that simple, my grandmother said, cutting her off with a flatness that left no room for the sentence Ashley had clearly been about to say. Ashley didn't explain. She looked back down at her wine glass, and for a moment nobody said anything. The whole table suspended in the specific discomfort of watching someone fail to produce a defense they'd apparently been counting on not needing. My grandmother reached into her coat pocket. She still hadn't taken it off, I realized. She'd walked into the house and sat down at the table without ever removing it, and I understood now that this hadn't been jet lag or forgetfulness. She had planned to keep it on, had planned this entire evening with more precision than any of us had given her credit for, and pulled out her phone. She set it on the table, screen facing up, and slid it toward the center where everyone could see it. I want to show everyone something, she said, before we go any further with explanations that aren't actually explanations. On the screen was a text message thread. I leaned forward to read it along with everyone else, and it took me a second to understand what I was looking at. And then it took me another second to understand why my grandmother had it at all. Kevin sent me this 11 months ago, my grandmother said, before I could ask, not knowingly. He forwarded something to me that he meant to forward to his father, about arranging his parents' move. I still get his emails from when I helped him set up an account years ago. Some settings never disconnected, and half the time these things just CC the wrong person. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away, but I kept it because something about it felt wrong even before I understood why. The message on the screen was between Ashley and Kevin from just under a year earlier. Sale price on paper is going to say $1. Grandma's overseas. She'll never check the actual paperwork. She barely even calls anymore, honestly. Just don't mention it to her if it comes up at Christmas. Let's not make this a whole thing. I read it twice, the way you read something twice when the first read doesn't feel like it could possibly mean what it says. My father's fork, which had been resting against his plate through most of this, finally made a small sound as it slipped from his fingers daggers and clattered against the china. My mother had gone very still beside him, staring at the phone like it might change what it said if she looked at it long enough. "You knew," I said to Ashley, and the words came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt this whole time. "When I called you in April, when I asked if I could stay with you for 2 weeks, you already knew there was a house. You already knew it had my name on it. You didn't tell me any of that. You just told me it wasn't a good time and to try mom and dad's instead." Ashley still wasn't looking up. Her jaw was tight, the specific tightness of someone holding back either tears or an excuse. I genuinely couldn't tell which. And at that moment, I don't think it would have mattered to me either way. "Say something," my grandmother said to her, and it wasn't gentle. "I didn't think it would matter," Ashley said finally, her voice small in a way I'd almost never heard it. "You weren't using it. You didn't even know it existed. It wasn't like I was taking something from you. You didn't know you had it." "That's not an argument, Ashley," my grandmother said. "That's a confession with better packaging." I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened after. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something more like vertigo. The specific dizziness of realizing that an entire year of your life, the couch, the apartment searches that kept falling through, the slow, humiliating math of what you could and couldn't afford, the moment in October when I'd cried in my car in a grocery store parking lot because I'd done the math on a security deposit and come up $400 short, all of it had been happening in the shadow of something that could have ended it completely if anyone in my family had simply told me the truth. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room like something physical, and I watched every single person at that table flinch, even my grandmother, though hers looked more like anticipation than surprise, the flinch of someone who knew exactly what was coming and was still bracing for it anyway. Ashley's face, which had already gone pale, went paler. She looked at the doorway like it might be about to deliver something worse than anything that had already happened, and I would learn in the next few minutes that her instincts were exactly right. "I'll get it," my grandmother said, standing up. She still hadn't taken off her coat. She came back a minute later with a woman I didn't recognize, tall, gray-suited, carrying a leather folder under one arm with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who does this kind of thing professionally and has never once needed to raise her voice to be taken seriously. "Everyone," my grandmother said. "This is Ms. Kessler. She's my attorney. I called her before I got in the car to come here tonight." I understood in that moment that everything my grandmother had done since walking through the door, the coat she'd never removed, the calm way she'd asked her question instead of exploding with it, the phone with the text thread already pulled up and ready, none of it had been improvised. She had walked into that dinner already knowing roughly what she was going to find, already having taken the first steps to address it before she'd even sat down to eat, and the rest of us had been reacting to a plan that was already 3 moves ahead of anything we understood. Ms. Kessler nodded lightly to the table, the kind of nod that acknowledges a room without pretending the room is comfortable, and set her folder down. "I want to be upfront," she said, "that I'm here at Mrs. Whitfield's request to review some documents related to the Cedar Lake property. I'd like to walk through what we found this afternoon, and then I think it will be clear why this couldn't wait until a more convenient time." She opened the folder. The first document was the original deed, the one my grandmother had described, my name on it, the purchase date from 3 years earlier. Everything exactly as she'd said. I looked at my own name printed on a legal document I'd never seen before in my life and felt a strange dislocation, the sense of encountering evidence of a version of my life I hadn't known was happening. "This is the deed as recorded 3 years ago," Ms. Kessler said. "Straightforward. Mandy is the sole owner of record. This is what should have remained the case." She turned to the second document. "This is a transfer agreement purporting to convey ownership from Mandy to Ashley, signed and dated 3 years ago as well, the same month as the original purchase, which on its face would suggest Mandy transferred the property to her sister almost immediately after receiving it." I stared at the signature on the line where mine should have been. It looked close to my handwriting. Not exact if you knew what to look for, but close enough that I understood immediately how this was meant to work, how it was meant to survive a casual glance from anyone who wasn't looking hard. "I didn't sign this," I said. "I know," Ms. Kessler said, "and I can tell you exactly how I know, because it's the reason I asked to come here tonight instead of waiting until Monday." She pulled out a third sheet, a report with a letterhead I didn't recognize, dense with paragraphs I would have skimmed past under any other circumstances. "Paper doesn't just carry ink," she said. "It carries a manufacturing signature, the specific composition of the stock, batch numbers, sometimes even embedded elements depending on the printer and the paper source. I had this document analyzed this afternoon because something about the timeline my grandmother described didn't sit right with me the moment she called. The paper this transfer agreement is printed on wasn't manufactured until approximately 6 months ago. I confirmed it directly with the mill, which means, regardless of what date is written at the top of this page, this document did not exist 3 years ago. It was created recently and backdated to make it look otherwise." The room went silent in a way that felt different from every silence that had come before it that night. The earlier silences had all had a kind of pressure to them, the held breath quality of people waiting to see how bad something was going to get. This one felt like the moment after something has already broken, when there's nothing left to wait for because the worst part has already happened. 6 months ago, my grandmother said slowly, is also, I believe, roughly when I first mentioned to this family that my work overseas was finally settling down, that I might be coming home sooner than expected. I watched that land on my parents' faces, watched them do the same math I was doing. 6 months ago, my grandmother had said something on a call, offhand probably, about maybe visiting soon. And within that same window, someone had produced a document meant to survive her actually checking. "Ashley," my grandmother said, "I want you to explain this to me. Not the house, not the in-laws. This. Yes, a forged document with your sister's signature on it, backdated to cover up something you'd already decided to hide from me the moment you heard I might come home and check. Ashley had started crying at some point during Ms. Kessler's explanation, not dramatically, just a slow leak that she seemed to be trying and failing to hold back, wiping at her face with the back of her hand between sentences. Dad told me to do it, she said. He said if there was ever paperwork missing, if you ever asked, we needed something that looked official. He said you'd never actually dig into it, that you'd take our word for it, that you wouldn't remember the exact details of a purchase from 3 years ago, when you barely even remember what day of the week it is half the time anymore. I remember exactly what day I wired $400,000 for my granddaughter's future, my grandmother said, and for the first time that night, her voice actually rose, not into a shout, but close to it. I remember the exact date. I remember the exact amount. I remember standing in a bank in Lisbon proud of myself for finally doing something meaningful with money I'd spent my whole life not having enough of. Don't you dare suggest I forgot. My father hadn't said anything through any of this. He was staring at the tablecloth, his jaw working slightly, the specific look of a man rehearsing several different defenses and discarding each one before it reached his mouth. You told her to forge this, I said to him, and it wasn't really a question. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. We were going to explain everything eventually, my mother said, her voice climbing towards something pleading. This wasn't meant to be permanent. We just needed some time to figure out the right way to bring it up. You have to understand how complicated. Before or after I froze outside in January, I said, because Priya's roommate finally said I couldn't keep staying there indefinitely, and I spent 4 hours in my car trying to figure out where I was supposed to go. Was that going to be before or after the right time to bring it up? Nobody answered that. My mother's mouth opened and closed once, the shape of a sentence that never actually arrived. Ms. Kessler, who had been quiet through the last exchange, cleared her throat and reached back into her folder. There's one more piece of this I think everyone needs to hear, she said, because it changes the nature of what's happened here from a family dispute into something closer to what my office would classify as elder fraud combined with financial exploitation. And I want to be precise about that distinction before we go any further. She pulled out a printed bank statement, several pages, and set it on the table. The couple currently residing in the property, Kevin's parents, have been making monthly payments for the last 11 months. $5,000 deposited on the first of every month into a personal checking account held in Ashley's name. My sister's face did something complicated, somewhere between panic and the specific defensive posture of someone about to argue a technicality. That was never rent, Ashley said quickly. That was a maintenance contribution. Kevin's parents wanted to help with the upkeep. It's a lake property, there's a lot of costs, it's completely different from renting it out. It's deposited on the same date every month, Ms. Kessler said, in the same amount, into a personal account under your name, with no maintenance invoices attached and no maintenance work performed on the property in that time period, according to the records I was able to pull this afternoon. I've reviewed several thousand of these arrangements over the course of my career. This is rent. Whatever word you'd prefer to use for it doesn't change what it legally is. I did the math out loud because I genuinely couldn't stop myself. The number arriving in my head faster than I wanted it to. 11 months, I said. $5,000 a month. That's $55,000. The number sat in the room like something with actual physical weight. $55,000, I said again, and I could feel my own voice shaking now, not with sadness, with something closer to disbelief that had curdled into fury somewhere in the last hour without my fully noticing it happen. You made $55,000 off a house that was mine while I was asking you for 2 weeks on your couch, and you told me your in-laws' schedule was unpredictable. You were collecting rent on my house the entire time you were telling me there wasn't room for me anywhere. Ashley didn't have an answer for that. She just cried harder. The specific ugly crying of someone who isn't crying because they're sorry, but because they've been caught in a way that has no exit left, no smaller lie available to soften the size of what's just been laid out on the table. My grandmother didn't look at her. She reached over and put her hand on my shoulder instead, steady in a way that made the whole room feel steadier even as it kept falling apart around us. Pack a bag, she said. Tonight. I stood up. My legs felt strange under me. The specific unsteadiness of a body that's been braced for a fight it didn't know was coming and now doesn't know how to stand down from it. Nobody at the table moved to stop me. My father was still staring at the tablecloth. My mother had both hands pressed flat against the wood like she was holding the table down, or holding herself up, I couldn't tell which. Miss Kessler was already gathering her folder, unhurried, the specific efficiency of someone who does this often enough that a family collapsing across a dinner table doesn't slow her hands down at all. At the door, my grandmother stopped and turned back, not to my parents, to Ashley, who still hadn't lifted her head from the napkin balled in her fists. I loved you the same as her, my grandmother said quietly, in a voice that didn't have any anger left in it, just something flatter and heavier, for 29 years. I want you to sit with that tonight while you figure out what you're going to say to Kevin's parents about why they need to be out of my house by Friday. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't seem to expect one. Outside, the cold hit differently than it had walking in 3 hours earlier, sharper somehow, though nothing about the temperature had actually changed. My grandmother's rental car sat at the curb with its hazards still blinking from when she'd pulled up in a hurry to make it before dinner started. You're coming with me, she said, unlocking the doors. We'll get your things from Priya's tomorrow. Tonight you're sleeping somewhere with your name on the deed. I looked back once at the house, my parents' house, lit up warm and yellow from every window the way it always was this time of year, decorations still up from when my mother had put them out 3 weeks ago, with no idea what this Thanksgiving was actually going to become. Through the front window, I could see Ashley still sitting exactly where I'd left her, shoulders curled forward, alone at a table nobody else had stayed to sit at with her. I got in the car. My grandmother pulled away from the curb without either of us saying anything else, and somewhere behind us, in a dining room full of cold turkey and a silence that wasn't going to lift anytime soon, my sister was still sitting there, finding out exactly what it cost to get caught.